He never read her last message. It was the ultrasound of their daughters. 4 years later, he saw them at the airport. Jonathan Miller had built his reputation on control, precision, and the refusal to allow anyone or anything to distract him from his ambitions. Every day of his life was a carefully orchestrated performance, a balance sheet of successes and acquisitions that left no room for weakness. His phone, always buzzing with messages and notifications, was an extension of that world, every word filtered, every conversation calculated for its potential value. So when a message from Claire appeared on his screen that evening, his reaction was almost automatic. He glanced at her name, felt the sharp sting of the argument they had last had, and without opening it, set the phone face down on the desk beside a stack of contracts awaiting his signature. In his mind, whatever she had to say could wait, or perhaps didn't matter at all. He had convinced himself that she was part of a chapter already closing, a distraction from the empire he was still building. What he didn't realize was that this was not just another message in a long chain of unfinished conversations. This one held an image that could have shattered the walls he had built around himself, a revelation of a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. Inside was the ultrasound, black and white lines forming shapes both fragile and miraculous, proof of the daughters he already had and refused to know. Claire had typed only a few words with it, words meant to bridge the silence between them, words that begged him to see beyond his pride. But he never pressed the screen, never let himself see. To him, the message was simply another reminder of a problem he didn't want to face, and by ignoring it he believed he was protecting himself. Instead, in that single careless choice, he condemned himself to years of emptiness he would not even recognize until it was far too late. While Jonathan buried himself in work, moving through the endless rhythm of meetings, contracts, and late-night strategy sessions, Claire sat alone, staring at the sent notification, waiting for the small indicator that he had read it. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into days, and still nothing came. Each morning she woke hoping for a reply, some sign that he had opened his heart enough to understand, but the silence that came back was louder than any words could have been. She placed her hand on her stomach, whispering to the lives growing inside her, promising them that they would never feel abandoned, that they would never grow up believing they were unwanted. The absence of his response told her all she needed to know. Jonathan, for his part, thought little of it. He told himself he had done the right thing by ignoring her, that he could not let himself be pulled into emotional entanglements that would weaken him. He believed that one unread message was meaningless, just another discarded attempt from someone who no longer belonged in his world. He didn't notice how often his thoughts drifted back to her late at night, or how empty the silence of his penthouse seemed once the workday ended. He poured another drink, scrolled through reports, and convinced himself that this was what strength looked like, moving forward without hesitation, without regret. He had no idea that regret was already there, waiting to bloom, hidden in the words and image he had refused to see. And so time moved on. Contracts were signed, towers were built, and headlines praised the ruthless efficiency of Jonathan Miller. Yet beneath all of it lay the weight of that unopened message, a weight he would not even feel until the day years later when he saw, with his own eyes, the 3 little girls who looked at him with the same blue eyes he saw every morning in the mirror. Only then would he understand that the moment he turned his back on Claire's message, he had not just ignored her. He had ignored his daughters, and in doing so, he had set into motion a story far heavier than any deal he would ever make. Claire sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the glow of the phone still burning in her eyes even though the screen had long since gone dark. She had sent the message with trembling hands, attaching the ultrasound and writing words that had cost her every ounce of courage she had left. In her heart, she believed that once he saw it, once Jonathan realized that there was more at stake than his empire or his reputation, something inside him would break open, and the man she had once loved would resurface. But as the hours passed and no reply came, the pit in her stomach deepened. She refreshed her phone again and again, staring at the little icon that never lit up, the one that would tell her the message had been read. It remained stubbornly gray, and with every silent minute that ticked by, she understood more clearly than ever that she was on her own. The next days were a blur of emotions. At first, she told herself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps he was busy with meetings, or traveling, or his phone had been misplaced. She clung to these excuses, but reality chipped away at them relentlessly. Jonathan never let anything slip past him in business. He noticed every detail, every opportunity, every threat. If he had wanted to read her message, he would have. If he had wanted to answer, he would have. That truth, simple and brutal, was impossible to deny. The man she had trusted with her heart, the man whose blue eyes once promised her safety and belonging, had chosen silence. Claire cried until her body ached, but when the tears were gone, resolve took their place. She would not beg again. She would not send another message into the void. Instead, she turned her energy toward survival, toward preparing for the lives that were coming whether Jonathan chose to acknowledge them or not. The doctor's words still echoed in her mind, triplets, 3 little heartbeats flickering on the screen like fragile lights, and while the thought terrified her, it also filled her with a determination she had never known. She had not planned for this, she had not asked to be left alone, but she would rise to the challenge because she had no other choice. The months of pregnancy were the hardest of her life. Her body strained under the weight of carrying 3 children, every step heavy with exhaustion, every day a battle against fear. There were nights she woke trembling, certain she could not do this alone, certain that she would collapse under the pressure. But then she would press her hand against her stomach and feel the faint flutter of movement, and the reminder of what she was fighting for gave her strength. She worked as much as her body would allow, cutting back hours when the strain became too much, relying on the kindness of neighbors in the small town she had fled to. With each passing month, the silence from Jonathan grew less like a wound and more like scar tissue, hardening her heart, teaching her to stand without leaning on anyone else. When the day came, it was chaos. The hospital room was filled with doctors and nurses, voices overlapping, machines beeping urgently as they brought 3 fragile lives into the world. Claire was exhausted, her body trembling with the effort, but when the cries of her daughters filled the air, she felt her chest crack open with a love so fierce it erased every doubt. Sophie, Lily, and Emma, 3 identical girls with dark hair damp against their foreheads and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow even in the hospital's harsh light. As she held them against her, one by one, tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow but of awe. She whispered to each of them that they were wanted, that they were loved, that they would never be made to feel like a burden. Those first years blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the constant juggling of 3 small lives who needed her completely. Claire worked when she could, slept when she could, and learned to live on sheer willpower. Every smile from her daughters made the struggle worth it, every giggle a reminder that her life still had light. There were moments of despair, moments when bills piled up or illness struck, when loneliness clawed at her, but she never regretted her choice. Jonathan's silence had forced her to discover a resilience she never knew she possessed, and though the pain of his rejection lingered, it no longer defined her. By the time the girls were 4 years old, Claire had created a world for them filled with laughter and stability, even if it lacked luxury. They knew bedtime stories and warm hugs, not the ache of absence. And while Claire sometimes wondered how she would one day answer their inevitable questions about their father, she pushed those worries aside for the time being. She had survived his silence, and she had built a family without him. What she did not know was that the man who had once ignored her message would soon have his own life shattered by the sight of what he had lost, and that their paths, no matter how far apart they seemed, were destined to collide again. Jonathan Miller's life in those 4 years was an endless climb higher up the ladder of power, and yet the higher he rose, the lonelier the air became. The world looked at him and saw a man who had everything: wealth that spanned continents, influence that made governments take his calls, and a reputation so formidable that rivals rarely dared to cross him. His image graced magazines, his name was whispered in admiration and envy at gala dinners, and his sharp blue eyes became a symbol of ruthless success. But when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, he returned each night to an apartment that echoed with emptiness, its glass walls reflecting not triumph but isolation. He had silenced the one person who had ever loved him without condition, and though he told himself he had made the right choice, the silence of his penthouse told another story. At first, Jonathan managed to bury any lingering thoughts of Claire under layers of work. He convinced himself she had moved on, that whatever message she had tried to send was just another plea he was right to ignore. He signed larger contracts, expanded his company into new markets, and sat at tables with kings and presidents. Yet sometimes, when exhaustion pressed heavy on his shoulders, he found himself scrolling through old photos of her. He remembered the way her laughter used to soften the hardest days, the way her blue eyes once looked at him as though he were more than his empire. Those memories came to him like ghosts, unwanted but persistent, and no matter how many times he shut them away, they returned. The irony was not lost on him. He had told himself that walking away from Claire meant freedom, that rejecting whatever future she carried meant he was preserving his strength. Instead, what he felt most often was the strange weight of something missing. He had built towers, but they gave him no warmth. He had surrounded himself with admirers, yet none of them knew how to touch the hollow in his chest. On the rare nights he allowed himself to wonder, he questioned whether her message had been something more than a demand, whether he had turned away from something he might one day regret. But pride was a fortress he had built too high, and he would not let himself scale it down. It wasn't until the fourth year that cracks began to show in that fortress. Jonathan was at an airport, returning from yet another deal sealed overseas, his thoughts focused on the speech he would deliver to the board that evening. The terminal was crowded, filled with travelers dragging luggage and children laughing, and he moved through them with the detached stride of a man who believed himself apart from ordinary life. And then, as if fate had staged it with cruel precision, he saw her. Claire. Her blonde hair glowed under the fluorescent lights, and she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered storms. His breath caught, but before he could process the sight of her, his eyes dropped to the three small figures walking at her side. Three little girls, no more than 4 years old, holding hands as they followed their mother. Their hair was dark, their faces nearly identical, and when one of them glanced up at him, Jonathan froze. He knew those eyes. They were his own. 3 pairs of piercing blue eyes stared back at him with innocent curiosity, and in that moment the walls of his carefully constructed life collapsed. The unread message slammed into his memory like a blow, and the truth he had denied for years stood before him, undeniable and alive. These were not coincidences, not strangers. They were his daughters. For the first time in his adult life, Jonathan felt his knees weaken. The man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals with unflinching calm suddenly found himself unable to breathe. He had missed everything: their first words, their first steps, their first years of life, and no amount of power or wealth could rewind time. His chest tightened as guilt, sharp and suffocating, surged through him. He remembered every excuse he had made, every reason he had used to justify his silence, and realized how meaningless they were now. He had not just ignored Claire, he had abandoned his own children. Claire's gaze found his, and the expression in her eyes was enough to cut him to the bone. There was no softness there, no warmth, only a quiet, guarded fury born of 4 years of survival without him. She held her daughter's hands tighter, her posture protective, as though shielding them from the very man who had given them life. Jonathan wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but the words stuck in his throat. All he could do was stand there in the middle of the bustling airport, watching the family he had thrown away walk past him as though he were nothing more than a stranger. That night, long after he had returned to his sterile apartment, Jonathan sat alone in the dark, his reflection in the window fractured by city lights. The faces of the girls haunted him, their hair, their eyes, the way they had clung to their mother. For the first time in years, he admitted the truth he had buried. His empire meant nothing without them. And though he did not yet know how, he swore to himself that he would not turn away again. The daughters he had refused to see had found him, and now he would do whatever it took to earn even a sliver of their trust. Jonathan could not erase the image of the airport from his mind. Every detail replayed with brutal clarity, the way Claire's hand had tightened around the three small ones, the protective wall she had built with her body as soon as she saw him, and the piercing blue eyes of the girls who had stopped his heart with a single glance. He sat through board meetings, signed contracts, and shook hands with officials, but nothing reached him. Words blurred into meaningless sound, numbers became indistinguishable shapes on the page, and every room seemed colder than it had before. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt powerless, and it terrified him more than any hostile takeover or looming scandal ever had. At night, when silence filled his penthouse, he poured himself drink after drink but found no comfort in the burn of expensive scotch. Instead, he stared out at the glittering skyline, remembering the way one of the girls had tilted her head, studying him with innocent curiosity. That look undid him more than Claire's fury ever could. It was not judgment, not hatred, it was simple, childlike wonder, and yet it carried with it a weight that crushed him. She did not know who he was, but she had seen something in him, some flicker of recognition that went beyond blood. He had once convinced himself that cutting ties with Claire was about protecting his freedom, about ensuring he would never be weakened by emotional obligations. But now, standing at the precipice of this revelation, he realized that freedom had been nothing more than a cage. He had locked himself inside his empire, and on the other side of the bars had grown three lives that belonged to him. The days after the airport encounter became a torment. Jonathan found excuses to pass through that same terminal, hoping to see them again, though he knew it was unlikely. He instructed private investigators to find out where Claire lived, what her life had become, and within days he had the answers laid neatly in a folder on his desk. He stared at the photographs longer than he should have, his throat tightening as he studied the life she had built without him. There was a small house with peeling paint, a modest car parked out front, and three girls playing in the yard, their laughter captured in frozen frames. Claire stood among them, her hair swept back in a simple knot, her face etched with fatigue but also radiant in a way that no photograph of him had ever been. It struck him with cruel force that she had done it alone, without his money, without his support, without even his acknowledgement, and she had succeeded where he had failed. She had built a family. Guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He remembered the last words he had spoken to her, the indifference with which he had dismissed her fears, the pride that had driven him to ignore her message. He had thought himself invincible then, untouchable, as though money and power placed him above the responsibilities of ordinary men. Now he understood that he had not risen above anything, he had simply fallen further, into a void that left him empty and bitter. He had thought ambition would shield him, but in reality it had stripped him of the only thing that mattered. And what made it worse was that the damage could not be undone. Those girls had lived 4 years without him. They had spoken their first words, taken their first steps, celebrated birthdays and holidays with only their mother by their side. He had missed it all, and nothing he did could give it back. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Jonathan drove to the neighborhood where Claire lived. He parked down the street, his expensive car gleaming awkwardly among the modest vehicles lined along the curb. From the shadows he watched them. The girls ran across the yard chasing one another, their voices high and musical, while Claire stood on the porch with her arms folded, calling out warnings and laughter in equal measure. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, every muscle in his body urging him to step out, to cross the distance and tell them who he was. But fear held him back. He had faced boardrooms of hostile investors without blinking, had stared down the most ruthless competitors in his industry, but this, approaching the woman he had betrayed and the daughters he had abandoned, this made him tremble. When Claire eventually ushered the girls inside, Jonathan remained in the car, his chest hollow and aching. He realized that simply watching from a distance would not be enough, that the ache in his chest would not fade until he had spoken the truth aloud. He no longer cared about pride, about image, about what anyone might say. The only thing that mattered was those 3 girls and the woman who had carried them alone. He whispered their names to himself, learned from the investigator's report, Sophie, Lily, and Emma, as if repeating them could summon the courage he needed. And as he drove back into the city that night, Jonathan knew one thing with absolute certainty: the man who had once ignored a message could no longer remain silent. He had to face the storm he had created, even if it destroyed him, because only through that storm could he hope to find a way back to the family he had never stopped needing. Jonathan spent days building up the courage to reach out, but when the moment finally came, it was nothing like the way he had rehearsed it in his mind. He had imagined long speeches, carefully crafted explanations, even apologies that sounded almost noble. But when he finally stood across from Claire again, none of those words seemed adequate, and all the polish of the businessman who had once commanded entire boardrooms with a single glance crumbled into dust. He had called ahead, leaving a message at her door, unsure if she would even respond, and when she agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe in town, he almost convinced himself she would not show. But she did. She arrived with her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup, her eyes steady but wary, as though every step toward him was one she regretted already. The silence between them at the table was thick, and Jonathan struggled to find words that would not sound like excuses. Claire, however, didn't give him the chance to set the terms. She leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp as she asked the question that had burned in her for 4 long years: "Why didn't you read it?" For a moment, Jonathan could not breathe. His entire body tightened as though the weight of the past had collapsed onto him in a single instant. He opened his mouth and closed it again, realizing that nothing he could say would erase the truth of what he had done. Still, he forced the words out. He admitted that he had been a coward, that his pride had made him believe he could simply ignore the parts of life that scared him, that he had thought pretending the problem didn't exist would make it disappear. His voice cracked as he confessed that he had been wrong, that not a day had gone by since the airport when he hadn't been haunted by the eyes of his daughters staring back at him. Claire listened without interrupting, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. When he finally finished, she shook her head slowly. "You don't get to show up now and expect me to open the door just because you regret it," she said. Her words were steady, but Jonathan could hear the tremor of old wounds beneath them. "I was alone for every doctor's appointment. Alone in that hospital room when they were born. Alone for every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every question I didn't know how to answer. You weren't there, and they don't know you exist. Do you understand what that means?" Her words cut him deeper than any corporate defeat ever had, and for the first time Jonathan felt the full weight of the years he had lost. He tried to explain that he didn't want to erase her strength or pretend he could undo the past, but that he wanted to begin, however late, to be present in the lives of his daughters. He told her he had nothing left to hide behind, that his money and power felt meaningless without them, and that he would give all of it away if it meant even one chance to earn their trust. His voice broke when he added that he was not asking her to forgive him for what he had done to her, because he knew some wounds could never be healed, but he begged her not to punish the girls by keeping them from knowing their father. The conversation grew heated. Claire's eyes filled with tears, not of weakness but of rage and exhaustion. She accused him of trying to claim a place in a story he had abandoned, of thinking he could walk in and be a father after years of silence. Jonathan did not argue. He let her anger pour over him, because he knew she deserved every word of it. For years he had lived untouched by consequences, always one step ahead of anyone who dared challenge him. But here, across from Claire, he sat stripped of all defenses, laid bare in a way that made him feel smaller than he had ever been. Eventually, when the storm of her fury quieted, a fragile silence fell between them. Claire wiped her cheeks and said softly, "They don't even know what a father is. To them, it's just a word. If you want to change that, it's not me you have to convince. It's them. And you'd better be ready to fight harder for them than you've ever fought for anything in your life." She stood to leave then, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag, and Jonathan knew she was giving him something rare, a chance, however slim, to prove himself. That night, Jonathan lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as her words replayed in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a strange kind of clarity. His empire could crumble, his fortune could vanish, and none of it would matter compared to the chance to stand beside his daughters. He knew the road ahead would not be quick or easy. He would have to break down walls built from years of absence and mistrust. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty: for Sophie, Lily, and Emma, he would not stop trying, even if it took the rest of his life. Jonathan's first real attempt to step into his daughters' lives came on a Saturday morning, one of those crisp days in early autumn when the air carried both warmth and chill. Claire had reluctantly agreed to let him meet them, not in private but in a park filled with people, where the safety of distance was always available to her if things became too heavy. He arrived early, his usual calm replaced by nervous energy, pacing near the swings like a man awaiting judgment. For once, the polished image of a CEO seemed to crumble, his suit replaced by a simple sweater and jeans, his hair slightly undone, his eyes betraying the sleepless night before. He looked less like a mogul and more like a man terrified of failing the most important meeting of his life. When Claire appeared, holding the small hands of three girls who looked so alike it was as though they had been cut from the same star, Jonathan nearly lost his breath. Sophie, Lily, and Emma. They wore matching jackets, their dark hair catching the sunlight, their blue eyes darting around with curiosity and laughter. They clung to their mother at first, giggling as they tried to guess who the tall man waiting for them might be. Claire crouched low and whispered something, her hand stroking their hair, and then she looked at Jonathan with a glance that carried both warning and surrender. She stepped aside slightly, allowing him space, though her presence loomed as protector and witness. Jonathan knelt down so he wouldn't tower over them, his knees sinking into the grass, his hands trembling as he extended them without expectation. For a moment, the girls simply studied him. One tilted her head, just as she had at the airport, another shifted behind her sister, and the third chewed her lip in quiet concentration. Jonathan's voice broke softly as he said, "Hello. My name is Jonathan, but you can call me Dad if you want." The word caught in his throat, as though foreign to him, yet it spilled out with a longing he could not contain. The girls exchanged glances, and then, with the innocence only children possessed, Sophie stepped forward. She touched his hand lightly, as if testing whether he was real, and then whispered, "Do you like swings?" The question shattered the tension. Jonathan laughed, a sound unpolished and raw, and replied, "I love swings. Maybe you can show me the best one here." Within minutes, the three of them were running ahead, pulling him toward the playground, their small voices filling the air. He pushed them one by one, his heart swelling with each shriek of laughter, his chest aching with the realization that he had missed years of this. Claire stood at a distance, her arms folded, watching as her daughters accepted the man she had long hated, not with caution but with the simple openness of children who longed to be loved. As the morning stretched on, Jonathan learned details that pierced him with both joy and grief. He discovered that Lily loved to draw animals, that Emma wanted to be a singer, and that Sophie was the one who always insisted on telling her sisters bedtime stories even when she was tired. They spoke of their favorite colors, their dislike of broccoli, and the silly games they invented together. Each revelation was a gift, but also a reminder of everything he had missed. He listened intently, storing every word like treasure, because he knew that for once, nothing mattered more than this. When lunchtime came, Claire spread a blanket under a tree, and Jonathan sat with them, awkward at first but slowly easing into the rhythm of their chatter. One of the girls climbed into his lap without hesitation, clutching a sandwich as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He froze, afraid to breathe, overwhelmed by the weight of the small body against his chest. Claire's eyes softened for the first time in years as she watched him, though her expression quickly hardened again when he met her gaze. She would not forgive easily, and he did not expect her to. But the simple fact that she had allowed this day to happen filled him with gratitude he could not articulate. As the sun dipped lower, Claire gathered the girls and prepared to leave. Jonathan's chest tightened with panic, the fear that this fragile connection might end as quickly as it had begun. He stood, his voice trembling as he said to Claire, "Thank you for today. You don't know what this means to me." She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, and replied, "You'll have to prove it's not just today." With that, she took the girls' hands, and they waved goodbye, their laughter still lingering in the air as they disappeared down the path. Jonathan remained in the park long after they had gone, sitting alone on the swing set where their laughter still echoed. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a CEO or a king of industry. He felt like a man who had been given a second chance at something he had once thrown away. And as he stared at the empty swing swaying gently in the breeze, he vowed that he would not let this chance slip through his fingers. If it took years of patience, humility, and persistence, he would spend every moment proving to Sophie, Lily, and Emma that their father was not just a title, but a promise. Jonathan's life began to change in ways he had not anticipated after that day in the park. For years he had been a man consumed by schedules, investors, and the relentless pursuit of profit, but now he found himself rearranging entire board meetings just to make sure he could attend a school recital or a soccer practice. His assistants whispered about how unusual it was for him to cancel dinners with foreign dignitaries in favor of spending an evening in a modest suburban neighborhood, yet he no longer cared. He discovered that power no longer held the same weight it once had, because every time he stepped into that little world Claire had built, he realized that this was where life truly happened. The skyscrapers he had constructed seemed smaller compared to the joy he felt when 3 pairs of blue eyes lit up at his arrival. Still, the road was not smooth. Claire remained cautious, often standing apart with her arms crossed, as if reminding him with every gesture that her trust was not a prize to be won easily. She watched him closely, testing his patience, waiting to see if his persistence was genuine or just another performance like the ones he had mastered in the corporate world. Jonathan did not fight her scrutiny. He accepted it, knowing he had earned every ounce of her suspicion. When she told him he could join them for dinner, but only if he brought nothing but himself, no extravagant gifts, no attempts to buy affection, he obeyed. That night, he sat at her worn wooden table eating spaghetti with his daughters, laughing when one of them spilled sauce on his shirt, and realizing that this simple, imperfect meal meant more than any banquet he had ever attended. Jacob, his trusted right-hand man at the company, noticed the shift as well. "You're different," he told Jonathan one morning as they prepared for a crucial negotiation. "You used to walk into a room like you already owned it. Now you look like you've got something to lose." Jonathan only smiled faintly, not bothering to deny it, because for the first time in his life he did have something to lose: 3 little girls who had become the heartbeat of his world, and the woman whose strength both intimidated and inspired him. He worked harder than ever, not to build higher towers or bigger deals, but to ensure that his daughters would never know the insecurity and absence he had forced upon them in their earliest years. The girls, too, began to change with his presence. At first they treated him like a novelty, someone new to play with, but soon they started to expect him. They saved drawings for him, ran to him at the park, and asked when he would come again. One evening, Sophie climbed onto his lap and asked if he would read her favorite bedtime story. He glanced at Claire for permission, and though her lips tightened, she gave the smallest nod. Sitting there with the book open and three little heads leaning against him, Jonathan felt a swell of emotion so fierce it nearly undid him. He stumbled over the words at first, but by the time he reached the last page, his voice was steady, and when he looked up, he found Claire watching him with an expression softer than he had seen in years. Despite these moments, the weight of his past choices hung heavily over him. One afternoon, as he walked the girls home, Emma tugged at his hand and asked with childlike honesty why he hadn't been there when they were born. The question pierced him more deeply than any accusation could have, because there was no answer that could make sense to a child. He knelt down, tears threatening, and whispered, "Because I made a mistake. The worst mistake of my life. But I promise you, I'm here now, and I'll never leave again." Emma looked at him for a long moment before nodding and running ahead, but Jonathan carried the weight of that question with him, knowing it would take years to prove the truth of his promise. As the weeks passed, Claire began to notice the small consistencies in his behavior. He showed up when he said he would. He never complained when the girls demanded his time. He learned the details of their routines, remembering which stuffed toy each of them needed to fall asleep, which one hated peas, and which one liked to braid her hair differently each morning. These were things he had once dismissed as trivial, yet now they were sacred to him, small pieces of proof that he was finally becoming the man he should have been from the start. One evening, as the girls slept and the house fell quiet, Jonathan lingered in the living room while Claire tidied up the kitchen. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and finally he broke the silence. "I know I can't undo what I've done," he said, his voice low and earnest. "But I will spend the rest of my life showing you and them that I can be better. Not the man who ignored you, not the man who thought his pride mattered more than love. I want to be their father, and I want to earn the chance to stand beside you, not as a stranger but as the man who should have been there all along." Claire didn't answer right away. She set the dish towel down and met his eyes, her expression unreadable, caught between the scars of the past and the fragile hope of something new. At last, she said, "You're not forgiven." "Not yet. But I see you trying, and for now, that's enough." Jonathan nodded, a quiet wave of relief washing over him. It was not redemption, not absolution, but it was the first real step toward something he had thought forever lost. And as he left the house that night, the sound of his daughter's gentle breathing echoing in his mind, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was not chasing a deal or a title. He was chasing the chance to be worthy of love, and for that, he would never stop running. Spring arrived quietly, and with it came a sense of renewal that Jonathan had not felt in years. The sharpness of winter melted away, and as the days grew longer, he found himself welcomed into more of the moments that once seemed forever denied to him. Claire still kept her distance emotionally, but she no longer barred the door. The girls had woven him into their daily lives, and it was impossible to miss the way their eyes lit up when they spotted him, the way their laughter seemed freer when he was near. Jonathan clung to these moments, not with the desperation of a man trying to prove himself overnight, but with the patient devotion of someone who understood that trust could only be built day by day. One Sunday morning, he arrived to take them all to the zoo. The girls buzzed with excitement, tugging at his arms, pointing to the map, demanding to see the lions first and then changing their minds to giraffes. Jonathan let them pull him in every direction, marveling at the way they seemed to know no boundaries with him now. Claire walked beside them, her posture still guarded but her eyes softer than before as she watched the scene unfold. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe he wasn't just passing through, that maybe this man had finally chosen the life he once rejected. Later that day, when the girls collapsed into bed exhausted, Jonathan lingered in the kitchen with Claire. The house was dimly lit, quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the air between them pulsed with something unspoken. He finally broke the silence, his voice raw. "I used to think being strong meant shutting people out, keeping control of everything. But I see now that strength is holding on, even when it scares you, even when it hurts. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to be here, with them, with you, if you'll let me." His words carried no demand, only truth, and it was that honesty that made Claire's chest tighten. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the man who had once turned away. Instead, she saw sincerity etched in every line, regret shadowing his eyes, and a kind of humility she had never thought possible for him. Her reply was quiet, almost fragile. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened. But I see the way they look at you, the way you look at them. I see you showing up. And maybe that's enough to start again, not as we were, but as something new." For Jonathan, those words were more precious than any deal he had ever signed, more valuable than the billions attached to his name. He nodded slowly, a lump in his throat, and whispered, "I'll never stop proving it." In the weeks that followed, their lives began to intertwine in ways that felt natural, even inevitable. Jonathan learned to braid hair with clumsy fingers until his daughters laughed and fixed his mistakes. He burned pancakes on Sunday mornings but kept trying until the kitchen filled with smoke and laughter. He knelt on the floor to help with puzzles, sat through tea parties with stuffed animals, and found himself captivated by the magic of their small world. With every moment, the girls grew more certain of him, and with every glance, Claire's walls chipped away a little more. The transformation did not happen overnight, but one evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold across the sky, Jonathan stood in the yard holding Sophie in one arm, while Lily and Emma clung to his legs, giggling uncontrollably. Claire leaned against the porch railing, her lips curved in the faintest smile, and in that quiet, Jonathan felt something he had never known before. This was home. Not the penthouse with its sweeping views, not the boardroom with its endless victories, but here, among the laughter of 3 little girls and the steady presence of the woman he had once lost. He realized then that redemption was not about erasing the past, because the past would always remain. Redemption was about living differently now, about choosing every day to be the man they needed, the man Claire could finally believe in again. And as twilight settled around them, Jonathan understood that though he had been a stranger once, though he had turned away from the very message that could have changed his life, he had been given a second chance. This time, he would not waste it. This time, he would hold on. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Miller, the billionaire CEO who once thought himself untouchable, felt truly rich. And it had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with the sound of his daughter's laughter and the fragile but growing trust in Claire's eyes. He had finally found the only empire worth keeping, and he would spend the rest of his days protecting it.